Close your eyes and imagine. The year is 1271. The world is vast and mysterious, filled with kingdoms that exist only in whispers and dreams. In the floating city of Venice, where gondolas drift like shadows between marble palaces, a 17-year-old boy stands at the edge of everything he has ever known. The salt air carries stories from distant shores. Silk merchants speak in hushed tones of lands beyond the horizon, of spices that taste like sunlight, of cities built from jade and gold. And tonight we follow that boy, Marco Polo, as he steps into the unknown. But before we begin this journey together, subscribe to the Dreaming of Past channel. Then leave a comment and tell us what other fascinating stories from history you'd love to hear whispered into the night. Now, dim the lights. Let the world around you fade. Close your eyes and listen. Tonight, you walk beside Marco Polo on the greatest adventure in human history. The Silk Road awaits, stretching like a golden thread across continents, through deserts that sing in the wind, over mountains that touch the heavens, to a court where the most powerful man on earth holds audiences beneath a canopy of stars. Let us begin. The morning mist clings to the Grand Canal like a memory that refuses to fade. In the pale light of dawn, Venice awakens slowly, her palaces emerging from the fog like ancient spirits returning to the world. The water laps gently against marble steps worn smooth by centuries of tides, and somewhere in the distance, church bells toll the hour with a sound that seems to come from another world entirely. Marco Polo stands at the window of his family's palazzo, watching the city emerge from its nightly slumber. At 17, he possesses that peculiar mixture of youth and wisdom that comes to those who have grown up listening to stories of distant lands. His father, Niccolo, and his uncle, Maffeo, have been gone for years now. Merchants who disappeared into the vast unknown of the East, leaving behind only letters that speak of wonders beyond imagination. The boy's fingers trace the wooden frame of the window, feeling the salt-worn grooves carved by decades of Venetian storms. Below, the first merchants of the day poled their gondolas through the narrow canals, their voices echoing off the water in that peculiar way that makes Venice sound like a city of ghosts. The air carries the scent of the sea, mixed with spices from the markets, cinnamon and cardamom, pepper and cloves, aromas that speak of journeys to places where the sun sets differently, where the very air tastes of adventure. Today feels different. Marco cannot name the sensation, but it sits in his chest like a bird preparing for flight. Perhaps it is the quality of the light, the way it seems to promise something just beyond the horizon. Or perhaps it is the dream he had last night, vivid and strange, of walking through a city made entirely of silk, where the buildings themselves seem to breathe and sway in an otherworldly breeze. His mother moves quietly through the house, her silk slippers whispering against the marble floors. She has grown accustomed to the waiting, to the silence that fills the spaces where her husband's voice should be. But Marco sees the way she pauses at doorways, the way her eyes drift toward the windows that face east, always east, toward the unknown lands where her beloved has vanished. The household servants speak in hushed tones of the letters that arrive sporadically, carried by merchants who have traveled impossible distances. They tell of the elder Polo brothers reaching the court of the great Khan, of audiences with the most powerful ruler the world has ever known. They speak of cities that float like mirages in the desert, of mountains so high they scrape the belly of heaven itself, of people who wear their wealth in threads of gold and live in palaces that would make the Doge's residence seem like a peasant's cottage. Marco has memorized every word of these letters, has traced the routes on the maps that merchant friends have drawn for him. But maps, he knows, are just dreams made manifest on parchment. The real journey exists in the spaces between the lines, in the vast unknown territories marked only with the phrase, "Here be dragons." As the sun climbs higher, burning away the morning mist, Marco feels something stirring in his soul. It is the same restlessness that has driven Venetian merchants to the corners of the earth, the same hunger for the unknown that has made his city the bridge between worlds. He thinks of his father and uncle somewhere in the vast expanse of Asia, and wonders if they can feel his thoughts reaching across the impossible distance. The day passes slowly, filled with the ordinary rhythms of merchant life. Marco attends to his studies, practices his languages, helps with the family business. But his mind wanders constantly, drifting like a ship without anchor toward thoughts of distant shores. He imagines caravans moving across endless deserts, their bells tinkling like music in the wind. He pictures cities rising from the horizon like dreams made solid, their domes and minarets catching the light of foreign suns. When evening falls, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Marco stands again at his window. The Grand Canal has become a river of liquid fire, reflecting the dying light with an intensity that makes the water seem to burn. Gondolas drift like black silhouettes against the flame-colored surface, their occupants wrapped in shadows and mystery. It is then that he sees them, two figures standing at the water's edge, their forms outlined against the burning sky. Even from a distance, even after years of absence, Marco recognizes the familiar shapes of his father and uncle. They have returned from the edge of the world, carrying with them the dust of 1,000 roads and the stories of a lifetime, but they are not alone. Between them stands a third figure, tall and imposing, dressed in robes that seem to capture and hold the last light of day. This is no ordinary merchant or traveler. This is someone who has walked in the presence of emperors, who has seen the face of power itself. Marco's heart begins to race as he realizes what this means. His father and uncle have not simply returned. They have come back with an invitation to join them on a journey that will take them to the very ends of the earth, to the court of Kublai Khan, the great Khan of the Mongols, ruler of the largest empire the world has ever known. The boy's hands tremble as he grips the windowsill. In the space of a heartbeat, his entire world has changed. The familiar comfort of Venice, the predictable rhythms of merchant life, the safety of the known, all of it seems suddenly small and confining. Beyond the horizon lies adventure on a scale that defies imagination, a journey that will test the very limits of human endurance and courage. As darkness falls over Venice, Marco Polo stands at the threshold of destiny. Tomorrow, he will leave behind everything he has ever known to follow a path that will take him across continents, through kingdoms that exist only in legends, to a court where the impossible becomes everyday reality. The stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, each one a distant light, marking the way to unknown worlds. Marco gazes up at them and feels the first stirrings of the wanderlust that will define his life. Somewhere among those stars lies his future, stretching out like a golden thread across the vastness of Asia. The greatest adventure in human history is about to begin. The palazzo fills with the scent of distant lands, sandalwood and jasmine, the warm spice of ginger and something else, something indefinable that speaks of air, breathed in places where no European has ever set foot. Marco descends the marble staircase slowly, his footsteps echoing in the vast hall, each sound seeming to carry the weight of anticipation. His father, Niccolò, stands in the center of the room, and Marco is struck by how the years have changed him. The merchant who left Venice was a man of comfortable middle age. The one who has returned bears the marks of extraordinary journeys. His skin is weathered by foreign suns. His eyes hold depths that speak of wonders witnessed and hardships endured. But there is something else, a vitality, an energy that seems to radiate from him like heat from a forge. Maffeo, his uncle, appears equally transformed. Where once he moved with the careful precision of a Venetian businessman, now he carries himself with the fluid grace of someone who has learned to walk on shifting sands, to navigate by stars that shine in alien constellations. His clothes, though travel-worn, are of a quality and style that Marco has never seen. Silk that seems to capture and hold light, patterns that speak of looms operated by hands that have never known European soil. But it is the third figure that captures Marco's attention and holds it like a spell. The man is tall and lean, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His robes are simple but rich, made from fabric that seems to change color as he moves, shifting from deep blue to purple to black, like the surface of a midnight sea. His face is weathered but ageless, with eyes that seem to hold the wisdom of centuries. "Marco," his father says, and the sound of his name carries across the years of separation like a bridge built from longing. "Come. There is someone you must meet." The stranger steps forward, and Marco sees that he moves with the contained power of a man who has spent his life in the service of emperors. When he speaks, his voice carries the accent of distant lands, each word carefully chosen and precisely delivered. "I am Kogus," he says, inclining his head in a gesture that manages to be both respectful and commanding. "I serve the great Khan, Kublai, ruler of the Mongol Empire, lord of the four corners of the earth. I bring greetings from the court of Kanbalik, and a summons." Marco feels the world tilt slightly, as if the very foundations of reality have shifted. He knows the name of Kublai Khan. Every merchant in Venice knows that name, spoken always in whispers, always with a mixture of awe and fear. The grandson of Genghis Khan, ruler of an empire that stretches from the edges of Europe to the shores of the Pacific, commander of armies that could sweep across continents like storm clouds across the sky. A summons? Marco's voice sounds strange to his own ears, as if it comes from someone else entirely. His father moves closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. The touch is warm and real, grounding him in the moment. The Khan has heard of our family's loyalty, of our service to his court. He wishes to meet you, Marco. He has plans. The word hangs in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Marco looks around the familiar room, the marble floors polished to mirror brightness, the tapestries depicting scenes of Venetian glory, the windows that look out onto the Grand Canal, and realizes that he is seeing it all as if for the first time. Or perhaps, he thinks with a sudden clarity that surprises him, for the last time. Kogus reaches into his robes and withdraws an object that makes Marco's breath catch in his throat. It is a tablet of gold, covered in script that flows like water, each character carved with such precision that it seems to glow in the lamplight. The weight of it, as Kogus holds it out, seems to pull the very air down around them. "The Paisa," Kogus says, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carries more authority than any shout. "The golden tablet of the Khan. To bear this is to carry the protection of the empire itself. Roads will open before you, cities will welcome you, armies will part like grass before the wind." Marco stares at the tablet, understanding instinctively that this is no mere piece of metal. This is a key that opens doors to worlds beyond imagination, a passport to realms that exist only in the fevered dreams of travelers. To accept it is to accept a destiny that will take him to the very edges of the known world. "The Khan remembers your father and uncle with great fondness," Kogus continues. "They brought him gifts from the West, stories of your Christian faith, knowledge of your customs. But more than that, they brought him something precious, honesty. In a court where truth is often buried beneath layers of flattery and deception, your family spoke plainly. This the Khan values above gold." Niccolo steps forward, his eyes meeting his son's with an intensity that speaks of long nights spent in discussion. of plans made and remade during the long journey home. "Marco, the Khan has specifically requested that you accompany us on our return. He wishes to see the son of the House of Polo to judge for himself whether the next generation carries the virtues of the current one." The room falls silent, except for the soft sound of water lapping against the palace walls outside. Marco feels the weight of the moment settling around him like a cloak. This is the crossroads, the moment when the path of his life will be chosen. He can remain in Venice, inheriting the family business, living a life of comfortable prosperity within the familiar boundaries of his world. Or he can step forward into the unknown, accepting an invitation that will take him to places that exist only in legends. He thinks of the maps he has studied, with their careful notations of known lands and their vast blank spaces marked only with warnings. He thinks of the stories he has heard of the Silk Road, that legendary highway that connects east and west, where caravans carry more than goods. They carry dreams, hopes, the very essence of human curiosity. The Khan's messenger waits patiently, his dark eyes seeming to read the thoughts that play across Marco's face. There is no pressure in his gaze, no attempt at persuasion. The choice, his expression says, is entirely Marco's own. Marco's mother enters the room quietly, her silk dress rustling like autumn leaves. She moves to stand beside her husband, and Marco sees in her face the same mixture of pride and fear that must have filled the hearts of mothers throughout history as they watched their children step toward destiny. She says nothing, but her eyes speak volumes, of love, of understanding, of the knowledge that some journeys must be taken regardless of the cost. The young man looks around the room one final time, at the faces of his family, at the familiar comforts of home, at the golden tablet that represents a future he cannot even imagine. Then, with a steadiness that surprises him, he steps forward and extends his hand. "I accept the Khan's invitation," he says, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. "I will journey to Khan Balik." Kogus places the golden tablet in Marco's palm, and the metal seems to pulse with warmth, as if it carries within it the very heartbeat of the empire. "Then you are now under the protection of the great Khan," he says formally. "The roads of the world are open to you." Outside, the night wind carries the scent of salt and adventure. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's bell tolls the hour, marking not just the passage of time, but the beginning of a journey that will become legend. Marco Polo, 17 years old, citizen of Venice, has just committed himself to a path that will take him across continents, through kingdoms that exist only in dreams, to a court where the impossible becomes everyday reality. The greatest adventure in human history has begun. The ship cuts through waters that seem to hold the very essence of mystery within their depths. Marco stands at the bow, feeling the salt spray on his face, tasting the tang of adventure on his lips. Behind him, Venice has faded into memory, becoming just another story told by the wind. Ahead lies the unknown, vast and welcoming as an unexplored continent. The Black Sea stretches endlessly in all directions, its surface reflecting the sky like polished obsidian. Marco has never seen water this dark, this deep. It seems to hold secrets in its depths, ancient stories of civilizations that rose and fell while the waves kept their eternal rhythm. The ship's captain, a weathered man with eyes the color of storm clouds, speaks of this sea with a reverence that borders on fear. The Euxin, he calls it, using the old Greek name, his voice dropping to a whisper when he thinks the passengers aren't listening. The sea where Jason sought the golden fleece, where the Argonauts faced monsters that could swallow ships whole. He crosses himself when he says this, though whether from Christian faith or older superstitions, Marco cannot tell. The days blur together in a rhythm of wind and wave. Marco spends his time learning, absorbing everything his father and uncle can teach him about the lands they will cross, the peoples they will meet, the customs they must observe. Each lesson is a thread in the vast tapestry of knowledge he will need to survive in realms where European ways mean nothing, where a wrong word or gesture could mean the difference between welcome and disaster. Niccolo spreads maps across the deck, their edges fluttering in the constant breeze. His finger traces routes that seem to meander across the parchment like the paths of migrating birds, following no European logic but obeying laws of geography and politics that Marco is only beginning to understand. The road to Cathay is not a road at all, his father explains, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. It is 1,000 roads, each one changing with the seasons, with the whims of local rulers, with the movement of armies and the shifting of alliances. What was safe passage last year may be a death sentence this year. Maffeo joins them, carrying a leather satchel that seems to contain the distilled essence of their previous journey. From it, he produces objects that make Marco's breath catch. A piece of jade so perfectly carved it seems to glow with inner light, a fragment of silk so fine it feels like captured moonlight, a small vial of spice that fills the air with scents of paradise. These are more than curiosities, Maffeo says, watching his nephew's reaction. They are languages, ways of speaking to people who have never heard of Venice, who worship gods we cannot pronounce. A gift given at the right moment can open doors that armies could not breach. The ship puts in at Trebizond, that ancient city perched on the edge of the world where east meets west in a collision of cultures and dreams. Marco's first step onto Asian soil is a moment of profound significance, though he doesn't fully understand it at the time. The very air seems different here, charged with possibilities that don't exist in the more familiar territories of Europe. The port bustles with activity that makes Venice seem quiet by comparison. Merchants from a dozen nations crowd the docks, their voices creating a symphony of languages that Marco has never heard. Armenian and Georgian, Arabic and Persian, tongues that flow like music and others that crack like whips. The air is thick with the scent of spices and sweat, with the smoke of cooking fires and the perfume of exotic flowers that bloom in climates he has never imagined. Their party expands here, taking on guides and guards, pack animals and supplies. Kyrgyz moves through the preparations with the efficiency of someone who has organized countless such expeditions. He speaks to the local officials in their own language, his voice carrying the authority of one who serves the Khan. Documents are signed, permissions granted, safe passage assured, at least for the next leg of their journey. Marco watches it all with the intense focus of someone who knows he is witnessing something that will shape the rest of his life. Every detail matters: the way the guides assess their animals, the manner in which the guards check their weapons, the careful negotiation over supplies that must last them across hundreds of miles of uncertain terrain. The road to Tabriz leads through country that seems to exist in a different world entirely. The landscape changes gradually, subtly, until Marco realizes they have left behind the familiar Mediterranean terrain and entered something altogether more exotic. The trees are different, their leaves shaped by foreign winds. The flowers bloom in colors that seem to have no names in European languages. Even the light itself seems different, filtered through air that carries the dust of distant deserts and the scent of mountains that have never known European snow. They travel in a small caravan, just large enough to provide safety without attracting unwanted attention. The camels move with a patient rhythm that seems to match the heartbeat of the land itself. Marco learns to read the subtle signs of the desert, the way the wind shifts to announce the approach of weather, the manner in which the animal's behavior changes to signal the presence of water or danger. At night they camp under stars that seem impossibly bright, arranged in patterns that tell stories Marco has never heard. The guides point out constellations that have guided travelers for centuries, stars that mark the way to legendary cities, celestial lights that shine on the courts of kings whose names are whispered in prayer. Around the campfire, stories are told that make Marco's breath catch in his throat, tales of cities that rise from the desert like mirages, of mountains that sing in the wind, of rulers who command the loyalty of jinn and the obedience of angels. The guides speak of the Khan's court with a reverence that borders on worship, describing palaces that make the grandest European castles seem like peasant huts. In Khan Balik, one of the guides says, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carries more weight than any shout, the Khan holds court in a hall so vast that birds nest in its ceiling, so rich that the walls themselves are made of gold. They say that when he speaks, the very air listens. Marco lies in his bedroll staring up at the alien stars and feels the magnitude of what he has undertaken settling over him like a weight. He is not simply traveling to a distant court. He is journeying to a world that operates according to rules he has never learned, where power is measured in ways he cannot comprehend, where the very concept of possibility has been redefined. The road to Tabriz stretches ahead like a golden thread, leading not just to a city, but to a transformation that will touch every aspect of his being. With each mile they travel, Marco feels himself changing, becoming something more than the Venetian merchant's son who left home. He is becoming a bridge between worlds, a living connection between the familiar and the impossible. The desert wind carries new scents, new sounds, new possibilities. And Marco Polo, 17 years old and infinitely curious, rides toward his destiny with the patience of the desert itself, knowing that the greatest adventures require not just courage, but the willingness to be transformed by the journey. The city emerges from the desert like a jewel set in golden sand, its walls rising from the horizon with the slow majesty of a sunrise. Tabriz, the name itself seems to carry the weight of centuries, rolling off the tongue like a prayer or an incantation. Marco sees it first as a shimmer in the distance, a wavering mirage that solidifies gradually into towers and domes, minarets and walls that seem to stretch toward heaven itself. The caravan approaches slowly, allowing the city to reveal itself in stages, like a dancer removing veils. First come the outer fortifications, massive walls built from stone that glows amber in the afternoon light. Then the gates, enormous portals topped with intricate carvings that tell stories in a script Marco cannot read, but somehow understands. Tales of conquest and glory, of merchants and kings, of the eternal dance between commerce and power. The air itself seems different here, charged with the energy of a place where cultures meet and mingle. The scent of spices drifts on the wind, cardamom and cinnamon, saffron and rosewater, mixed with the earthy smell of dust and the exotic perfume of flowers that bloom only in Persian soil. Marco breathes it in deeply, feeling it settle into his lungs like a drug that changes the very nature of perception. The Pearl of Persia, Kogus says, his voice carrying a note of pride that suggests deep familiarity with this place. Capital of Azerbaijan, crossroads of the world. Here the silk routes from China meet the spice roads from India, the gold caravans from Africa, cross paths with the fur traders from the northern steppes. All the wealth of the world flows through this city like water through a fountain. The gates open before them with a grandeur that makes Marco's breath catch. The guards who check their documents are clearly soldiers, but soldiers unlike any he has seen in Venice. They move with the fluid grace of dancers, their armor gleaming like liquid metal, their weapons bearing the mark of smiths who have elevated warfare to an art form. When they see the golden Pisa, their entire demeanor changes, and they bow with a respect that seems to come from the very core of their being. Inside the walls, Tabriz unfolds like a living tapestry. The streets are wide and well paved, lined with buildings that seem to compete with each other in their display of wealth and artistry. Merchants' houses rise like palaces, their facades decorated with tiles that catch and reflect the light in patterns that shift and change as the sun moves across the sky. Gardens glimpsed through ornate gates reveal fountains that turn water into music, flowers that bloom in colors that seem to have no names. The bazaar is a world unto itself, a covered market that stretches for what seems like miles in every direction. Marco follows his father and uncle through its maze-like passages, his senses overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of wonders on display. Here are silks from the looms of Cathay, their colors so pure and intense they seem to glow with inner light. There are spices from the islands of the East, precious stones from mines that exist only in legend, perfumes distilled from flowers that bloom once in a lifetime. The merchants who hawk these wares are as exotic as their goods. Marco sees faces that speak of every corner of the known world, the weathered features of desert nomads, the delicate bone structure of people from lands where the sun sets differently, the proud bearing of those who have walked in the courts of kings. Each face tells a story of journeys undertaken, of risks taken and fortunes won or lost, in the great game of commerce that connects all the world. This is how the Khan maintains his empire, Niccolo explains, as they pause at a stall selling precious stones. Not just through armies and administrators, but through trade. Every merchant who carries goods along the Silk Road is an ambassador. Every caravan is a messenger service. Every transaction is a thread in the web that holds the empire together. They are received in the governor's palace with a ceremony that makes Marco understand for the first time the true power of the Khan's authority. The governor himself, a man whose bearing suggests he has commanded armies and ruled provinces, greets them with the deference due to personal representatives of the great Khan. The palace where they are housed is a marvel of Persian architecture, its rooms cooled by ingenious systems of air circulation, its walls decorated with paintings that seem to move in the lamplight. At dinner, they are served on plates of gold and silver, with delicacies that challenge every assumption Marco has ever made about food. There are fruits that taste like concentrated sunlight, meats prepared with spices that create flavors he has never imagined, wines that seem to carry the essence of distant vineyards in their bouquet. The very act of eating becomes a journey of discovery, each bite revealing new possibilities for pleasure. The conversation flows around the table like wine, touching on topics that range from the price of silk in distant markets to the movements of armies on the empire's borders. Marco listens with the intensity of a scholar, understanding that he is receiving an education in the realities of power that no European university could provide. These men speak casually of distances that would take months to traverse, of cities that exist only as names on maps, of rulers whose decisions can affect the lives of millions. The Khan grows old, the governor says at one point, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carries more weight than any shout. There are those who think of succession, who position themselves for the future, but the Khan's mind remains sharp, his will unbroken. He has plans, schemes that reach decades into the future. After dinner, they are entertained by musicians and dancers whose art seems to transcend the merely human. The music flows like water, like wind, like the very voice of the desert itself. The dancers move with a grace that seems to defy the laws of physics, their bodies telling stories that need no words, their gestures painting pictures in the air that linger in the mind long after the performance ends. Marco lies that night in a bed more comfortable than any he has ever known, surrounded by luxury that makes his family's Venetian palazzo seem austere by comparison. But comfort is not what keeps him awake. It is the realization that he has crossed a threshold, that he has entered a world where the very concept of possibility has been redefined. Through his window, he can see the lights of the city stretching away into the darkness, each one representing a life, a story, a dream that has brought someone to this crossroads of the world. The air carries the sound of distant music, of voices speaking in languages he has never heard, of the eternal rhythm of commerce and culture that makes places like Tabriz the true capitals of the world. Tomorrow they will leave this pearl of Persia, continuing their journey toward the court of the Khan. But Marco knows that Tabriz has changed him, has opened his mind to possibilities he never imagined. He is no longer the merchant's son who left Venice. He is becoming something new, something that exists in the spaces between cultures, a bridge between worlds that have never been connected. The road ahead stretches into mystery, leading to encounters with peoples and places that exist only in the realm of legend. But Marco Polo, 17 years old and infinitely curious, faces that unknown future with the patience of the desert and the wisdom of the bazaar. He has tasted the wine of possibility, and he is forever changed by its flavor. In the distance, a caravan bell tolls the hour, marking not just the passage of time, but the rhythm of the road that will carry him to the ends of the earth and beyond. The air grows thinner with each step, each breath becoming a conscious effort as they climb toward the roof of the world. The Pamir Mountains rise around them like the frozen architecture of gods, their peaks scraping the belly of heaven itself. Marco has never imagined such heights, such vast expanses of stone and snow that seem to exist in a realm beyond the merely earthly. The caravan moves slowly now, the pack animals struggling with the altitude, their breath forming clouds of vapor that hang in the crystal-clear air like ghostly prayers. The guides speak in whispers, their voices carrying a reverence that suggests they understand they are traversing sacred ground. Here at the edge of the world, ordinary rules no longer apply. Time moves differently, space bends and stretches, and the very air seems to pulse with an ancient power. Marco wraps his cloak tighter around his shoulders, feeling the bite of wind that has never known warmth, that carries the scent of snow and stone and something else, something that might be eternity itself. His father and uncle move beside him with the patient endurance of men who have made this journey before, but even they seem subdued by the majesty of the landscape that surrounds them. The roof of the world, Kogus says, his voice barely audible above the wind. Here the earth reaches toward heaven, and sometimes, if you are very quiet and very patient, you can hear the angels singing. They follow paths that seem to have been carved by the wind itself, narrow tracks that wind around precipices where a single misstep would mean a fall into valleys so deep they seem to drop into the very heart of the earth. The horses pick their way carefully, their hooves finding purchase on stone that has been polished by countless passages of wind and weather. The landscape is alien in its beauty, painted in shades of blue and white and grey that seem to have no names in any earthly language. The snow glows with an inner light, reflecting the sun in patterns that shift and change like living things. The sky above is a blue so pure and intense it seems to vibrate with color, while the clouds that drift across it appear close enough to touch. Marco finds himself moving in a kind of trance, his mind struggling to process the sheer scale of what he is witnessing. These mountains make the Alps seem like gentle hills, their peaks rising so high they seem to pierce the dome of the sky itself. The silence is profound, broken only by the wind and the soft sound of the animals breathing, the occasional clink of metal against stone. At night, they camp in valleys that seem to exist in a different world entirely. The cold is bone deep, a living thing that seeps through clothing and blankets to settle in the marrow. The campfires burn with a strange intensity in the thin air, their flames seeming to dance with spirits that have no names. The stars above are so bright and so numerous They seem to press down on the earth like a blanket of diamonds. In these mountains, one of the guides tells them, his voice carrying the weight of old stories, live the fire worshippers, the followers of Zoroaster, who keep the sacred flames burning in temples carved from living rock. They say that when the world ends, it will be from these heights that the final judgment will be proclaimed. The days blur together in a rhythm of climb and rest, of struggle and endurance. Marco learns to read the subtle signs of altitude sickness, to pace himself so that each breath counts, to find warmth in the movement of muscles and the circulation of blood. He discovers reserves of strength he never knew he possessed, depths of determination that surprise even him. The wildlife here is unlike anything he has ever seen. Great horned sheep with curling horns pick their way across impossible slopes, their movements as graceful as dancers. Snow leopards leave prints in the snow that speak of grace and power, though the cats themselves remain invisible, ghosts that haunt the edges of vision. Eagles soar at altitudes that would kill a man, their wings catching thermals that rise from valleys heated by the distant sun. The Khan maintains way stations even here, Maffeo explains, as they approach a small fortress built into the very face of a cliff. His empire reaches to the edges of the world, to places where only the wind and the snow are permanent residents. The way station is a marvel of engineering, carved directly into the living rock of the mountain. Its rooms are small but warm, heated by a system of channels that carry hot air from fires deep within the stone. The keeper of the station is a man who seems to have been shaped by the mountains themselves, his face weathered by wind and snow, his eyes holding the patience of stone. He greets them with the formal courtesy due to bearers of the Khan's paisa. But Marco senses something more in his manner, a deep respect for anyone who has undertaken this journey, who has chosen to pit themselves against the challenges of the roof of the world. The man has spent his life at this altitude, and he moves with the careful precision of someone who understands that a single mistake can mean death. "You are fortunate," he tells them as they sit around the fire, sharing a meal of dried meat and barley soup. "The weather has been kind. I have seen caravans trapped here for weeks, waiting for storms to pass, their supplies dwindling as the wind howls like hungry spirits." That night, Marco lies in his narrow bed, listening to the wind as it moves through the peaks above them. It creates a symphony unlike anything he has ever heard, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a roar, sometimes a haunting melody that seems to carry voices from another world. He thinks of Venice, of the gentle lapping of water against marble, and marvels at the distance he has traveled, not just in miles but in understanding. The morning brings views that steal the breath from his lungs. The sun rises behind peaks that seem to float in the sky, painting the snow-covered slopes in shades of rose and gold that have no earthly equivalent. The light moves across the landscape like a living thing, revealing valleys that stretch into infinity, ridges that march toward horizons that seem to exist beyond the edge of the world. They resume their climb, following paths that wind ever upward toward passes that seem impossibly high. The air becomes so thin that each step requires conscious effort, each breath a precious gift that must not be wasted. Marco learns to move with the patient rhythm of the mountains themselves, understanding that haste here is not just foolish, but potentially fatal. It is at the highest pass, a narrow gap between peaks that seem to touch the very face of heaven, that Marco experiences something that will remain with him for the rest of his life. Standing at what feels like the top of the world, surrounded by silence so profound it seems to have weight, he feels a transformation taking place within his soul. Below him stretch ranges of mountains that extend to every horizon, wave after wave of peaks that fade into the distance like thoughts dissolving into dreams. Above him the sky is so blue and so vast it seems to swallow the earth itself. He stands at the junction of earth and heaven, at a place where the ordinary world ends and something transcendent begins. From here, Kogus says, his voice hushed with reverence, you can see the curvature of the earth itself. You stand where eagles fear to fly, where the air is too thin for any but the strongest to survive. You have reached the place where heaven and earth touch. Marco feels tears freezing on his cheeks as he gazes out at the impossible vista spread before him. He understands, with a clarity that cuts through him like the mountain wind, that he has been changed by this journey in ways that go far beyond the merely physical. The boy who left Venice no longer exists. In his place stands someone who has walked at the edge of the world, who has breathed the air of heaven itself. The descent begins gradually, following valleys that wind down toward distant lands where the air grows thick again, where trees can grow and men can breathe without effort. But Marco carries the mountains with him now, their silence and their majesty imprinted on his soul like a brand that will never fade. They are descending toward the great plateau of Central Asia, toward the heartland of the Mongol Empire, toward roads that will carry them to the court of the Khan himself. But the roof of the world has given Marco something that no earthly court can match, a perspective that sees beyond the merely human, an understanding that there are powers in the world that dwarf the ambitions of kings and the schemes of merchants. The wind follows them down from the peaks, carrying the scent of snow and stone and the infinite sky. And Marco Polo, 17 years old and transformed by altitude and awe, walks toward his destiny with the patience of mountains and the silence of snow. He has touched the edge of heaven, and he will carry that touch with him to the ends of the earth. The city rises from the desert like a dream made manifest in stone and gold, its domes catching the morning light and throwing it back, transformed into something that speaks of paradise itself. Samarkand, even the name carries magic, rolling off the tongue like poetry, like prayer, like the whisper of silk against silk. Marco sees it first through the heat shimmer of the afternoon, a vision that wavers between reality and mirage, between the possible and the divine. As they draw closer, the city reveals itself in layers of wonder. The outer walls stretch for miles, built from bricks that seem to glow within a fire, their surfaces decorated with patterns that flow like water frozen in time. Gates open before them like the portals to another world, revealing streets paved with stones that have been polished to mirror brightness by the passage of countless caravans. The air itself seems different here, heavy with the scent of roses and jasmine, with the sweet smoke of incense and the exotic perfume of spices that have traveled impossible distances to reach this crossroads of the world. Marco breathes it in deeply, feeling it settle into his lungs like a drug that changes the very nature of perception. The jewel of Samarkand, Kogus says, his voice carrying a note of pride that speaks of deep familiarity with this place. Here Timur the Lame dreamed of conquering the world, and his dreams took shape in stone and gold. Every building is a poem, every street a verse in the great epic of human ambition. They are received at the city gates with a ceremony that makes Marco understand the true reach of the Khan's authority. Officials dressed in robes that seem to capture and hold light bow deeply at the sight of the golden paisa, their entire manner transforming from formal courtesy to genuine reverence. Guards who carry themselves like princes escort them through streets that seem designed to inspire awe in the hearts of visitors. The governor's palace where they are housed is a marvel that challenges every assumption Marco has ever made about human achievement. Its walls are covered with tiles that tell stories in images, tales of conquest and glory, of merchants and kings, of the eternal dance between power and beauty that defines the greatest civilizations. The ceiling soars overhead like a stone sky, painted with stars that seem to move in the lamplight. This is power made visible, Niccolo explains, as they walk through halls that echo with the whisper of silk slippers on marble floors. The Khan rules not just through force but through beauty, through the creation of wonders that make men glad to be part of his empire rather than afraid to oppose it. The bazaars of Samarkand stretch for miles in every direction, covered markets that form a city within the city. Marco follows his guides through passages that wind like rivers through caverns of wonder, past stalls where merchants from every corner of the world display treasures that seem to glow with their own light. Here are silks from the looms of Cathay, their colors so pure they seem to have been distilled from rainbows. There are carpets from Persia, their patterns so intricate they seem to move and shift as you watch them. Precious stones from mines that exist only in legend catch the light and throw it back in fragments of concentrated color. Perfumes distilled from flowers that bloom once in a lifetime fill the air with fragrances that speak of gardens in paradise. The merchants who hawk these wares are themselves as exotic as their goods. Marco sees faces that tell stories of journeys that span continents, of risks taken in pursuit of profit and glory. There are the weathered features of desert nomads who have crossed the great sand seas of Central Asia, the delicate bone structure of people from the silk kingdoms of the Far East, the proud bearing of those who have walked in the courts of emperors. Every thread of silk that passes through this market, Maffeo explains as they pause at a stall selling fabrics that seem to shimmer with their own light, has traveled 4,000 miles to get here. Every spice has crossed deserts and mountains, survived storms and bandits, carried hopes and dreams across impossible distances. At the caravanserai where they rest, Marco meets travelers whose stories stretch the boundaries of belief. There is a merchant from Cathay who speaks of cities that float on lakes, of bridges made from single blocks of jade, of emperors who live in palaces so vast that messengers use horses to carry messages from one wing to another. Another tells of islands in the southern seas where pearls grow on trees, where birds talk in human languages, where the very air is perfumed with spices. The world is larger than any map can show, an old caravan master tells him, his eyes holding the wisdom of decades spent crossing impossible distances. There are kingdoms beyond kingdoms, peoples beyond counting, wonders that no single lifetime could encompass. The Khan's empire is vast, but even it is just a fraction of what exists beyond the horizon. That evening they are entertained in the palace with performances that seem to transcend the merely human. Dancers move with a grace that appears to defy the laws of physics, their bodies telling stories that need no words. Musicians play instruments that seem to capture the very voice of the wind, creating melodies that linger in the mind long after the last note has faded. The conversation at dinner flows like wine around topics that span continents. These men speak casually of cities that exist only as names in legend, of rulers whose decisions affect the lives of millions, of trade routes that connect the edges of the world. Marco listens with the intensity of a scholar, understanding that he is receiving an education in the realities of power that no European university could provide. The Khan grows thoughtful in his age, the governor mentions at one point, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carries more weight than any shout. He speaks often of legacy, of what will remain when the last horse has been ridden, the last arrow shot. He gathers knowledge now as once he gathered conquests. After the formal dinner, Marco walks alone through the palace gardens, following paths that wind between fountains that turn water into music. The air is soft and warm, perfumed with the scent of night-blooming flowers that seem to glow in the darkness. Above, the stars shine with a brilliance that makes the sky seem like a vast tapestry sewn with diamonds. He finds himself at a pavilion overlooking the city, where the lights of Samarkand stretch away into the darkness like fallen stars. Each light represents a life, a story, a dream that has brought someone to this crossroads of the world. The soft sound of distant music drifts on the night air, mixing with the whisper of wind through the trees and the gentle splash of water in marble basins. Marco stands there for a long time, feeling the weight of the journey that has brought him to this moment. He thinks of Venice, of the narrow canals and familiar faces, and marvels at the distance he has traveled, not just in miles, but in understanding. He is no longer the merchant's son who left home with dreams of adventure. He is becoming something new, something that exists in the spaces between cultures, a bridge between worlds that have never been connected. Tomorrow they will leave this jewel of Central Asia, continuing their journey toward the court of the Khan. But Samarkand has given him something precious, a vision of what human achievement can accomplish when ambition is wedded to beauty, when power serves not just conquest, but creation. The night wind carries new scents, new sounds, new possibilities. Somewhere in the distance, a caravan bell tolls the hour, marking not just the passage of time, but the rhythm of the road that connects all the world. And Marco Polo, 17 years old and infinitely curious, stands at the crossroads of dreams, ready to continue his journey toward the most powerful court on earth. The greatest adventure in human history continues, carrying him toward encounters with wonders that exist only in the realm of legend, toward a destiny that will transform not just his own life, but the understanding of the world itself. The desert spreads before them like an ocean of gold and silence, its waves frozen in stone and sand that stretch beyond the horizon to places where the earth meets sky in a line so clean it seems drawn by the hand of God himself. The Gobi, even its name carries the weight of legend, spoken always in whispers by those who have never crossed its vastness, sung in the ancient songs of those who have survived its trials. Marco sits astride his camel, feeling the rhythm of the animal's patient gait, the rise and fall that matches the breathing of the desert itself. Around him, the caravan moves with the fluid grace of creatures born to this landscape, the pack animals stepping carefully through sand that shifts and flows like water made solid. The guides speak in voices that seem to come from far away, their words carried on wind that tastes of dust and dreams. Here begins the true test, Kugus says, his voice barely audible above the soft whisper of sand against sand. The Gobi shows no mercy to the unprepared, no forgiveness to those who do not understand her moods. She has swallowed armies, erased cities, buried the dreams of conquerors in sand that shifts with every wind. The landscape is alien in its beauty, painted in shades of gold and amber and rust that seem to glow with inner fire. The dunes rise and fall like the thoughts of sleeping gods, their curves sculpted by winds that have blown since the world was young. In the distance, mountains rise like islands in a sea of sand, their peaks sharp as broken glass against the endless blue of the sky. The silence here is profound, broken only by the soft sound of the animals breathing, the creak of leather, and the gentle bell song of the caravan. It is a silence that seems to have weight, to press down on the soul with the accumulated quiet of centuries. Marco finds himself whispering when he speaks, understanding instinctively that loud voices would be somehow sacrilegious in this cathedral of emptiness. The days blur together in a rhythm as old as the desert itself. They travel through the cooler hours of morning and evening, resting during the heat of midday in whatever shade they can find. The shadow of a rock, the meager shelter of a stunted tree that has somehow found the strength to survive in this wasteland. The sun blazes overhead with an intensity that seems to burn the very air, turning the sky white-hot at its zenith. Marco learns to read the subtle signs of the desert, the way the wind shifts to announce the approach of sandstorms, the manner in which the light changes to signal the presence of distant oases. The guides point out landmarks that would be invisible to untrained eyes, a rock formation that indicates direction, a pattern in the sand that speaks of water buried far below. the flight of birds that reveals the location of hidden springs. The desert remembers everything, one of the guides tells him, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind. Every caravan that has passed this way leaves its mark if you know how to read the signs. The bones of those who failed become part of the sand, their dreams absorbed into the eternal song of the wind. At night they camp under stars that seem close enough to pluck from the sky, their light so brilliant it casts shadows on the sand. The temperature drops with startling swiftness, the desert releasing the heat of the day in great waves that rise like spirits into the darkness. Campfires burn with a strange intensity in the dry air, their flames dancing with shadows that seem to tell stories older than memory. Around these fires, the guides share tales that make Marco's breath catch in his throat. Stories of cities that rise from the sand at certain seasons, their walls made of crystallized air, their inhabitants the ghosts of those who died of thirst. Tales of dragons that sleep beneath the dunes, their breathing causing the sandstorms that can bury an entire caravan in minutes. Legends of oases that appear only to the pure of heart, where the water tastes of paradise and the fruit grants eternal life. In the heart of the Gobi, one guide whispers, his voice dropping to barely audible, stands the city of Jade, built by the first Khan from stones that fell from heaven. They say it appears only once in a generation, and only to those who carry the favor of the eternal sky. The journey tests every aspect of human endurance. The heat during the day is crushing, a living thing that seems to squeeze the very life from the body. The cold at night is equally brutal, seeping through clothes and blankets to settle in the bones. Water becomes more precious than gold, each drop rationed with the care of a miser counting coins. Marco discovers reserves of strength he never knew he possessed, depths of determination that surprise even him. He learns to find water in the morning dew that collects on his clothes, to navigate by stars that wheel overhead in patterns that tell the story of the world's turning. His skin burns and peels and burns again, becoming as weathered as leather, as tough as the hide of the desert animals. It is on the seventh day that they encounter the phenomenon that gives the Gobi its fearsome reputation, a sandstorm that rises from the southern horizon like a wall of gold and fury. The guides spot it early, their experienced eyes reading the signs that speak of approaching catastrophe. They drive the caravan toward a rocky outcropping, seeking whatever shelter can be found in this barren landscape. The storm strikes with the force of a living thing, turning day into night and filling the air with sand that cuts like razors. Marco huddles with the others behind their makeshift shelter, feeling the wind tear at his clothes, hearing it howl like the voice of all the demons that have ever haunted the dreams of desert travelers. The sand finds its way into everything: clothes, food, water, even the spaces between thoughts. For 3 days, the storm rages with undiminished fury. The world disappears into a golden chaos, where direction becomes meaningless, where the only reality is the wind and the sand and the desperate struggle to survive. Marco loses track of time, of space, of everything except the basic need to breathe, to endure, to wait for the fury to pass. When the storm finally subsides, it leaves behind a landscape transformed. Dunes have moved like migrating animals. Familiar landmarks have been erased. New formations have appeared as if sculpted by the hands of giants. The caravan emerges from shelter like survivors of a great battle, their faces marked by the ordeal, their eyes holding the knowledge of those who have looked into the face of nature's raw power and lived to tell the tale. "The desert has tested you," Kyrgyz says as they prepare to resume their journey, his voice carrying a note of respect that was not there before. "You have felt her fury and survived her trial. Now she will allow you to pass to the lands beyond." As they continue eastward, Following paths that seem to exist more in memory than in reality, Marco feels the desert changing around them. The sand gives way gradually to scrub grass. The dunes flatten into rolling hills. The air carries new scents that speak of water and growing things. They are approaching the edge of the Gobi, the threshold between the wasteland and the green lands of Cathay. But the desert has left its mark on Marco's soul, branding him with its silence and its vastness, its beauty and its cruelty. He carries within him now the patience of sand and the endurance of stone, the wisdom of those who have learned to find water in the desert of despair and hope, in the wasteland of impossibility. Ahead lies the heartland of the Mongol Empire, the green valleys and shining cities that surround the court of the great Khan. But Marco Polo, 17 years old and transformed by sand and silence, will carry the desert with him forever, its lessons written in his bones, its songs echoing in his dreams, its eternal rhythm beating in his heart like a second pulse that connects him to the infinite patience of the earth itself. The threshold of dreams has been crossed, and there is no turning back. The palace rises from the Mongolian grasslands like a vision from a dream of paradise, its walls shimmering in the distance with an ethereal quality that makes Marco question the very nature of reality. Shangdu, Xanadu, as it will be remembered in poetry and legend, spreads across the landscape with the casual grandeur of an emperor's whim made manifest in marble and gold. The approach reveals the palace in stages, each more magnificent than the last. First come the outer gardens, vast expanses of carefully tended wilderness, where deer graze beneath trees that seem to have been placed by the hand of an artist. Streams wind through this manufactured paradise like silver ribbons, their waters singing songs that speak of mountain springs and eternal summers. The Khan's summer retreat, Kogus explains, his voice carrying a note of awe that speaks of countless visits that have never dimmed his wonder. Here Kublai Khan comes to escape the weight of empire, to remember what it means to be human rather than merely powerful. Every stone was placed with purpose, every tree planted with intention. The walls of the palace proper are unlike anything Marco has ever seen, built from marble that seems to glow with inner light, decorated with patterns that flow like frozen music across their surface. Gates open before them with the silent grace of well-oiled mechanisms, revealing courtyards that stretch away into distances that seem to defy the laws of geometry. Inside, the palace unfolds like a living manuscript written in stone and gold. Corridors wind through halls so vast that their ceilings disappear into shadows that might hide entire worlds. Pillars rise like the trunks of cosmic trees, supporting domes that seem to capture and hold the very essence of sky. Water flows everywhere, in fountains that turn liquid into song, in channels that wind through rooms like indoor rivers, in pools that reflect light, in patterns that shift and change like living things. Marco walks through this wonderland in a state of amazement that borders on intoxication. Every surface tells a story. Every decoration speaks of craftsmanship that elevates the merely human to the level of the divine. The floors are mosaics that depict scenes from legend and history, their tiny tiles creating images so detailed they seem to move in the shifting light. The walls are covered with tapestries that tell the story of the Mongol Empire, their threads woven from silk and golden dreams. This is power made visible, Niccolo says as they follow their guide through galleries lined with treasures from every corner of the empire. Not the crude power of the sword, but the refined power of civilization itself. The Khan rules not just through fear, but through beauty, through the creation of wonders that make men glad to be part of his realm. They are housed in apartments that would make a European king weep with envy. The rooms are spacious and airy, cooled by ingenious systems that circulate air through hidden channels in the walls. The furniture is carved from woods that Marco has never seen, inlaid with ivory and mother-of-pearl in patterns that seem to tell stories in a visual language all their own. The beds are more comfortable than any Marco has ever known, their mattresses stuffed with the down of exotic birds, their covers woven from silk so fine it feels like captured moonlight. The windows look out onto gardens where flowers bloom in colors that seem to have no names, where paths wind between groves of trees that bear fruit that tastes like concentrated sunshine. But it is the people of the palace who truly astound Marco. They move with the quiet efficiency of those who serve by choice rather than compulsion, their faces serene, their manner speaking of deep satisfaction with their role in this grand enterprise. They come from every corner of the empire, the delicate features of the silk lands, the weathered faces of the steppes, the proud bearing of the desert kingdoms, yet they work together with the harmony of a great orchestra performing a cosmic symphony. The Khan chooses his servants carefully, Maffeo explains as they watch the seamless operation of the palace around them. Not just for their skills, but for their loyalty, their understanding that they serve something greater than any individual. They are not slaves but artists, creating beauty and order on a scale that defies imagination. At dinner, they are served in halls that seem to stretch toward infinity, their tables laden with delicacies from every corner of the known world. There are fruits that have traveled impossible distances to reach this table, wines that have aged in cellars carved from living rock, meats prepared with spices that create flavors Marco has never imagined possible. The conversation flows around these tables like wine, touching on topics that span continents and centuries. Marco finds himself seated next to scholars who speak casually of measuring the circumference of the earth, of artists who paint with pigments ground from precious stones, of engineers who design bridges that seem to float in air. The very atmosphere crackles with intellectual energy, with the excitement of minds that have been freed from the mundane concerns of survival to pursue the highest achievements of human culture. The Khan believes that knowledge is the true treasure, one scholar tells him, his eyes bright with the fever of discovery. Gold can be spent, armies can be defeated, but understanding is eternal. He gathers the wise men of the world not to serve his ambition, but to serve truth itself. After dinner, they are entertained with performances that seem to transcend the merely human. Dancers move with a grace that appears to defy the laws of physics, their bodies telling stories that need no words. Musicians play instruments that seem to capture the very voice of creation, creating harmonies that resonate in the soul long after the last note has faded into silence. But it is the storytellers who hold Marco's attention most completely. They speak of the Khan's conquests not as simple military campaigns, but as epic tales of transformation, of the collision between different ways of seeing the world. They tell of cities that surrendered not to force, but to the promise of participation in something greater than themselves, of peoples who chose to join the empire rather than resist it, because they recognized the vision it represented. That night, Marco lies in his silken bed, listening to the soft sound of water flowing through the palace's hidden channels, to the distant music that seems to emerge from the very stones themselves. Through his window, he can see the lights of the palace stretching away into the darkness, each one representing a life dedicated to the creation and maintenance of this wonder. He thinks of Venice, of the narrow canals and familiar faces, and marvels at the journey that has brought him to this place. He is no longer the merchant's son who left home with dreams of adventure. He has become something new, something that exists in the spaces between cultures, a bridge between worlds that have never been connected. Tomorrow he will meet the Khan himself, Kublai Khan, ruler of the largest empire the world has ever known, grandson of the great Genghis, heir to a legacy of conquest and creation that spans continents. But tonight, Marco Polo sleeps in paradise. dreaming dreams that are shaped by marble and gold, by the sound of flowing water and the soft whisper of silk against silk. The summer palace holds him gently in its embrace, preparing him for the encounter that will define the rest of his life. In the morning he will stand before the most powerful man on earth, but for now he rests in beauty, surrounded by wonders that speak of human achievement elevated to the level of art. The greatest adventure in human history continues, carrying him toward a meeting that will transform not just his own destiny, but the understanding of what it means to be human in a world where the impossible has become everyday reality. The hall stretches away into distances that seem to challenge the very concept of enclosed space, its ceiling disappearing into shadows that might conceal entire kingdoms. Pillars rise like the trunks of world trees, their surfaces carved with dragons that seem to move in the shifting light, their golden scales catching and reflecting illumination that comes from sources Marco cannot identify. The floor beneath his feet is a masterpiece of craftsmanship that tells the story of empire in patterns of jade and jasper, lapis lazuli and gold. Each step carries him across representations of conquered territories, over images of cities that have bent the knee to Mongol power, through artistic renderings of rivers and mountains that mark the boundaries of dominion that spans half the world. The air itself seems different here, charged with an energy that speaks of absolute authority, of decisions that can alter the course of nations with a single word. Incense burns in hidden braziers, its smoke creating patterns that drift through the vast space like the dreams of sleeping gods. The scent is complex, otherworldly, sandalwood and myrrh, roses and spices that have no names in any European language. Marco walks forward with measured steps, following the protocol that has been drilled into him during days of preparation. His father and uncle move beside him, their faces composed but their eyes alert, aware that they are approaching a presence that few human beings ever encounter. Behind them, Kogus maintains the formal bearing of one who has performed this ritual countless times, yet still feels the weight of the moment. Courtiers line the walls like living statues, their silk robes rustling with the soft sound of wind through autumn leaves. They represent every corner of the empire, the pale complexions of the northern steppes, the weathered features of the desert kingdoms, the delicate bone structure of the silk lands. Yet all wear the same expression of profound respect, the same understanding that they stand in the presence of power that transcends the merely human. The throne itself rises from the far end of the hall like a mountain sculpted from precious metal and dreams. It is not merely a seat, but an architectural marvel, carved from a single block of jade so pure it seems to glow with inner light. Dragons wind around its base, their eyes set with rubies that burn like captured stars. The canopy above is cloth of gold that seems to capture and hold the essence of sunlight itself. And seated upon this marvel, as naturally as a hawk perches on a cliff, is Kublai Khan. Marco's first sight of the great Khan challenges every assumption he has ever made about what power looks like when it becomes flesh. This is not the barbarous warlord of European imagination, not the crude conqueror whose name is whispered in fear around Western hearths. This is a man of perhaps 60 years, his face marked by intelligence and curiosity rather than mere cruelty, his bearing speaking of someone who has learned to carry the weight of empire with grace rather than brutality. The Khan's eyes are what arrest Marco's attention, dark and deep, holding depths that speak of decades spent contemplating the mysteries of rule, of power, of the human condition itself. They are the eyes of someone who has seen everything the world has to offer and found it interesting rather than merely useful, someone who views existence as a vast puzzle to be understood rather than simply conquered. "Approach," the Khan says, his voice carrying clearly across the vast space without apparent effort. The sound is cultured, refined, speaking of education that encompasses philosophy as well as strategy, poetry as well as politics. Let us see the son of the House of Polo. Marco steps forward, following the careful choreography of court protocol. At the prescribed distance, he drops to one knee, his head bowed in the precise angle that acknowledges authority without suggesting subservience. The marble beneath his knee is cool and smooth, polished by centuries of such genuflections. "Rise," Kublai Khan commands, and there is something in his tone that suggests genuine interest rather than mere formality. "Come closer. Let me see your face." Marco stands and approaches until he is within conversational distance of the throne. This close, he can see the details that distance had obscured. The quality of the Khan's robes, silk so fine it seems to be woven from light itself. The craftsmanship of the golden ornaments that speak of artisans whose skills border on the supernatural. The subtle intelligence that plays around the ruler's eyes like summer lightning. "For you are younger than I expected," the Khan observes, his voice carrying a note of amusement. "Your father and uncle spoke of a merchant's son, but I see before me someone who has already been marked by the road, changed by the journey. Tell me, young Marco of Venice, what do you see when you look upon the court of the great Khan?" The question hangs in the air like incense, weighted with implications that Marco is only beginning to understand. This is no mere formality but a test, an evaluation that will determine his place in the hierarchy of empire. He takes a breath, feeling the eyes of the entire court upon him, understanding that his next words will shape the course of his life. "I see power made beautiful, my lord," Marco replies, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I see the dreams of nations made manifest in stone and gold. But more than that, I see wisdom given form, knowledge transformed into something that serves not just conquest but creation." A smile touches the corners of the Khan's mouth, subtle but unmistakable. Diplomatically said, but there is truth in it as well. "Your journey here was educational?" "Transforming, my lord. Each mile taught me something about the vastness of your realm, the diversity of peoples who choose to serve your vision rather than resist it." "Choose," the Khan repeats, leaning forward slightly. "An interesting word. My grandfather Genghis believed in the power of the sword to reshape the world. I have learned that true empire is built not on fear alone, but on the willing participation of those who see something greater than themselves in our endeavor." The conversation continues for what feels like hours, ranging across topics that span philosophy and politics, trade and military strategy, the nature of power, and the responsibilities of rule. Marco finds himself drawn into a discussion that challenges every assumption he has ever made about leadership, about empire, about the very nature of civilization itself. The Khan speaks of his vision for the empire, not as a mere accumulation of conquered territories, but as a synthesis of the best elements of every culture it encompasses. He tells of universities where scholars from every tradition work together to unlock the secrets of the natural world, of trade routes that carry not just goods but ideas, of cities where people of different faiths and customs live in harmony because they are united by common purpose. "I am told you have a gift for languages," the Khan says at one point, his eyes measuring Marco with the precision of a jeweler evaluating a precious stone. "That you learn quickly, adapt easily to new customs. These are valuable qualities in one who would serve the empire. I am honored by your interest, my lord." "Interest, yes, but more than that. Opportunity. The empire spans half the world, young Marco, but it remains largely unknown to the other half. I have need of someone who can serve as a bridge between worlds, who can carry messages not just of trade, but of understanding." The implication hangs in the air like a golden thread, connecting Marco's past to a future he has never dared imagine. The Khan is offering him something more than mere employment. He is proposing that Marco become his personal ambassador to the unknown, his emissary to realms that exist beyond the current boundaries of empire. Your father and uncle will return to Venice, the Khan continues, his voice carrying the weight of decision made. They will carry messages to your Pope, gifts that speak of our desire for communication between our realms. But you, if you choose, will remain here as my guest, my student, my representative to territories that have never known the touch of Mongol authority. Marco feels the weight of destiny settling around him like a cloak. This is the moment toward which his entire journey has been leading, the crossroads where his life will be defined. He can return to Venice with his father and uncle, carrying tales of wonders seen and adventures survived. Or he can step forward into a future that promises experiences beyond imagination, responsibilities that will challenge every aspect of his being. I am honored by your trust, my lord, Marco says, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he is accepting. I will serve the Empire to the best of my abilities. The Khan nods slowly, his eyes holding depths that speak of satisfaction mixed with calculation. Then it is decided. You will remain at court, learning our ways, studying our languages, preparing yourself for journeys that will take you to the edges of the known world and beyond. The formal audience concludes with ceremonies that seem to transform the very air around them. Marco finds himself invested with titles that carry weight throughout the empire, given seals and documents that will open doors in the farthest corners of Mongol territory. But more than the formal recognition, he carries with him the memory of those dark, intelligent eyes, the sense of having been measured and found worthy by someone who has held the fate of nations in his hands. As he leaves the throne hall, walking backward in the prescribed manner until he reaches the great doors, Marco feels the weight of transformation settling into his bones. The boy who entered this hall no longer exists. In his place walks someone who has been chosen by the most powerful man on earth, someone whose future will be written in territories that exist only as dreams on the edges of maps. That night, alone in his chambers, Marco stands at his window looking out over the gardens of Shangdu. The palace spreads around him like a city of light, its illuminated windows speaking of lives dedicated to purposes that transcend the merely personal. In the distance he can hear the soft sound of music drifting on the night air, the eternal symphony of a court that never truly sleeps. He thinks of his father and uncle, already preparing for their journey back to Venice, carrying messages that will bridge the gap between East and West. But his own path leads in a different direction, toward horizons that shimmer with possibility, toward adventures that will test the very limits of human endurance and understanding. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, each one a distant light marking the way to unknown worlds. Marco gazes up at them and feels the first stirrings of the wanderlust that will define the next decades of his life. Somewhere among those stars lies his future, stretching out like a golden thread across the vastness of Asia and beyond. Tomorrow, his real education will begin. Not in the comfortable classrooms of Venice, but in the vast university of empire, where every lesson is written in the movement of peoples and the rise and fall of civilizations. He will learn languages that have never been heard by European ears, study customs that challenge every assumption about human nature, travel roads that lead to places where the very concept of possibility has been redefined. The greatest adventure in human history continues, carrying him toward a destiny that will make him the bridge between worlds, the living connection between the known and the impossible. Marco Polo, 17 years old and chosen by fate, stands at the threshold of legend, ready to write his name across the map of the world in letters of gold and wonder. The winter capital spreads before Marco like a vision of ordered majesty, its walls and towers rising from the plain with the geometric precision of a dream made manifest in stone and gold. Khan Balik, the Khan's city, the center of the world's largest empire, stretches beyond the horizon in all directions, a metropolis that makes Venice seem like a country village, Rome like a modest town. 2 years have passed since that first audience in Chengdu. 2 years of learning that have transformed Marco from a curious youth into something approaching a scholar of empire. He speaks Mongolian now with the fluency of a native, reads Chinese characters with the ease of a Mandarin, navigates the complex protocols of court with the grace of someone born to power. But more than languages and customs, he has absorbed something deeper, an understanding of how the world's largest empire actually functions, how it maintains order across distances that boggle the European mind. The Khan has become something between a teacher and a father to him, taking personal interest in his education, involving him in discussions that range from military strategy to philosophical speculation. Marco has sat in on councils where the fate of kingdoms is decided with casual words, has witnessed the machinery of empire operating with a precision that makes clockwork seem crude by comparison. "Today you begin your true service," Kublai Khan tells him as they stand on a balcony overlooking the vast city below. The Khan's face shows the years that have passed, but his eyes remain sharp, alert, filled with the same intelligent curiosity that marked their first meeting. "I am sending you to Yunnan, to the southern provinces where the empire's authority still sits lightly on peoples who remember independence." The mission stretches before Marco like a golden thread leading into the unknown. Yunnan, a name that carries mystery, speaking of valleys shrouded in perpetual mist, of peoples who have never bowed to any foreign authority, of kingdoms that exist in the spaces between the known and the legendary. He will travel as the Khan's personal representative, carrying authority that could reshape the destiny of entire peoples. "You will not go as a conqueror," the Khan continues, his voice carrying the weight of carefully considered policy. "The empire has armies enough for conquest. You will go as a bridge builder, as someone who can speak to these peoples in ways that mere force cannot achieve. Learn their customs, understand their fears, find the common ground that makes willing cooperation preferable to grudging submission." The preparation for the journey takes weeks, involving not just the gathering of supplies and guards, but intensive study of the territories he will traverse. Marco pores over maps that show regions where European cartographers have written only, "Here be dragons," learning the names of rivers that flow through valleys no Western eyes have ever seen, studying the customs of peoples whose existence is barely suspected in the halls of European power. The expedition that finally sets out from Khan Balik is a marvel of organization that reflects the empire's administrative sophistication. There are guides who know every mountain pass and river crossing, translators who speak the dialects of a dozen different peoples, craftsmen who can repair anything that might break during months of travel through hostile terrain. But it is the authority Marco carries that truly astounds him. Documents sealed with the Khan's personal seal that transform him from a foreign youth into the voice of empire itself. Local officials who have never heard of Venice bow deeply at the sight of these papers, understanding that they face someone who speaks with the authority of the throne itself. The journey south takes them through landscapes that seem to exist in a different world entirely. The Great Wall of Mountains that protects China's heartland gives way gradually to valleys where the air grows thick and warm, where vegetation explodes in shades of green that have no names in northern languages. Rivers wind through gorges so deep they seem to pierce the very heart of the earth, their waters carrying the runoff of snows that cap peaks invisible in the distance. Marco travels with the patience he has learned from 2 years at court. understanding that haste in such terrain is not just foolish, but potentially fatal. The roads, where they exist at all, wind around precipices that drop into valleys so deep the bottoms disappear into mist. Bridges span chasms that would challenge the engineering skills of any European architect, their structures so light and elegant they seem to float in air. The peoples they encounter grow more diverse with each mile traveled. There are tribes that still live in the old way, following herds across grasslands that stretch to horizons unmarked by any permanent settlement. Others have built cities that seem to grow organically from the landscape itself, their architecture shaped by local materials and climate in ways that create beauty without sacrificing function. Each people has something to teach, Marco writes in the journal he keeps for the Khan's review. The horsemen of the steppes understand movement and speed in ways that could revolutionize military strategy. The mountain dwellers have developed engineering techniques that could transform construction across the empire. The valley farmers have created irrigation systems that turn desert into garden. In Yunnan itself, he encounters a civilization that challenges every assumption he has made about the relationship between complexity and development. The local kingdoms have created societies that function with elaborate courtesy, where disputes are settled through rituals that transform potential violence into elaborate theater, where art and life interpenetrate so completely that every daily activity becomes a form of aesthetic expression. The capital city where he is received rises from its valley like a composition in jade and gold, its buildings arranged according to principles that balance human need with natural harmony. The ruler who greets him is a man of perhaps 50, his manner suggesting someone who has learned to command through wisdom rather than mere force. "We have heard of the great Khan's power," the local king tells him during audiences that stretch for days, feeling out the possibilities and limitations of accommodation. But power alone does not create lasting peace. What can the Khan offer us that we do not already possess? It is a question that goes to the heart of Marco's mission, requiring him to articulate the empire's vision in terms that make sense to people who have created their own successful civilization. The conversations range across topics that span trade and military protection, cultural exchange, and administrative efficiency, the delicate balance between local autonomy and imperial unity. "The Khan does not seek to remake you in the image of Mongolia," Marco explains, drawing on months of careful study of imperial policy. "He seeks to include you in a larger enterprise, one where your knowledge and skills contribute to something greater than any single kingdom could achieve alone." The negotiations continue for weeks, involving not just formal discussions, but elaborate ceremonies, shared meals, hunting expeditions that allow both sides to demonstrate their capabilities without threatening postures. Marco finds himself serving not just as translator, but as cultural interpreter, helping each side understand not just what the other is saying, but what they mean, what values and assumptions underlie their positions. The final agreement reached satisfies both sides in ways that pure conquest never could. Yunnan retains its internal autonomy, its traditional rulers, its customary laws, but it also gains access to the empire's trade networks, its military protection, its accumulation of knowledge and technique. Local products, particularly the precious woods and medicinal herbs for which the region is famous, find new markets across the empire, while imperial technologies and administrative methods help solve local problems that have persisted for generations. "This is how empire truly grows," Marco writes in his final report, understanding for the first time the full genius of the Khan's approach to expansion. Not through the simple imposition of external will, but through the creation of relationships that benefit all parties, that make cooperation more attractive than resistance. The journey back to Khanbalik takes him through territories that now seem familiar, but Marco travels with changed eyes. He has learned to see the empire not as a collection of conquered territories, but as a vast web of relationships, each strand strengthening the whole, each connection creating new possibilities for growth and development. The Khan receives his report with the satisfaction of someone whose judgment has been vindicated. "You have done well," he tells Marco, his voice carrying warmth that goes beyond mere approval. "You have proven that the Empire's greatest strength lies not in its armies, but in its ability to include, rather than simply dominate, to grow through addition, rather than subtraction." That night, Marco stands once again on the palace balcony, looking out over the lights of Khan Balik. But now he sees the city differently, understanding it as just one node in a network that spans continents, one voice in a symphony that includes the songs of 100 different peoples. He has become part of something larger than himself, something that transcends the boundaries of nation and culture, to embrace possibilities that exist only when human beings choose cooperation over conflict. The boy who left Venice in search of adventure has become a man who helps shape the destiny of empires. The greatest adventure in human history continues, carrying him toward encounters with peoples and places that exist at the very edges of imagination, toward a future where the impossible becomes everyday reality. The oasis city shimmers in the desert heat like a jewel set in golden sand, its walls rising from the Taklamakan desert with the patient majesty of a civilization that has learned to thrive at the edge of the world. Kashgar, the name itself carries the weight of legend, spoken in whispers by merchants who dream of the fabulous profits that await those brave enough to traverse the Silk Road's most treacherous passages. Marco approaches the city after months of travel that have taken him across landscapes that exist at the very limits of human endurance. The Taklamakan stretches behind him like an ocean of silence, its dunes marked only by the bones of caravans that miscalculated their water supplies or lost their way in sandstorms that can erase landmarks with the casual cruelty of gods. But ahead lies the promise of water, of shade, of the human warmth that makes survival possible in places where nature offers only death. 4 years have passed since his first mission to Yunnan. 4 years of traveling the Empire's farthest reaches as the Khan's personal emissary. Marco has become something unique in the world, a bridge between cultures, a translator not just of languages, but of entire ways of seeing reality. His reports have helped the Khan understand territories that exist beyond the reach of conventional administration, peoples whose loyalty must be won rather than simply commanded. The gates of Kashgar open before him with the same ceremony that has marked his arrival at 100 other cities across the empire. The guards who check his credentials are weather-beaten men whose faces speak of decades spent watching the horizon for raiders, for sandstorms, for the distant dust clouds that announce the approach of caravans carrying the wealth of continents. When they see the Khan's seal, their entire demeanor changes. They bow with the deep respect due to one who carries the authority of empire itself, but Marco senses something more in their manner, a genuine warmth that speaks of people who understand the value of connections that span impossible distances, of messages that link their isolated outpost to the great world beyond the desert. "Welcome, Lord Marco," the city's governor greets him, using the title that has accumulated around his name during years of service. "We have been expecting you." The Khan's message arrived 3 months ago, carried by riders who nearly died bringing it across the desert. Your mission to the Western Kingdoms has been the subject of much speculation. The mission stretches before Marco like a golden thread, leading into territories that exist at the very edge of reliable knowledge. He is to travel beyond the Empire's current borders, into the kingdoms of the far west, where European merchants have never ventured, carrying messages of trade and alliance to rulers whose names are barely known, even in the Khan's court. The caravan that gathers for this journey is unlike any Marco has seen in his years of travel. There are merchants from every corner of the empire, their goods representing the accumulated wealth of a dozen different civilizations. Silks from the workshops of Hangzhou lie beside carpets from Isfahan. Spices from the islands of the south share space with furs from the forests of the north. But it is the diversity of the people themselves that truly astounds Marco. The Silk Road has always been more than a trade route. It is a highway of cultures, a pathway along which ideas and techniques flow as freely as goods. The caravan includes not just merchants but scholars, artists, religious teachers, craftsmen whose skills have made their names known in courts thousands of miles from their birthplaces. Every man in this caravan carries 2 cargoes, an old merchant tells Marco as they prepare for departure. The goods he can weigh and count and the knowledge he has gathered from places where the stars shine differently. The second cargo is often more valuable than the first. The journey west takes them through territories that seem to exist in a different world entirely. The road follows ancient paths that wind between mountain ranges whose peaks scrape the belly of heaven, through valleys where rivers run jade green with the melted snow of glaciers that have never known human touch. Cities rise from these landscapes like miracles, their domes and minarets catching the light of suns that set differently in these distant latitudes. At Samarkand, that jewel of Central Asia, Marco pauses to deliver messages from the Khan to local administrators, to gather intelligence about conditions further west, to replenish supplies for the most challenging portion of the journey. The city's bazaars bustle with activity that makes even Kashgar seem quiet by comparison, their covered passages echoing with the voices of merchants who speak in tongues from every corner of the known world. The road ahead grows dangerous, local traders warn him. Their face is serious despite the potential profits that successful completion of his mission would bring. There are kingdoms beyond the Oxus that know nothing of the Khan's authority, peoples who see strangers only as targets for their swords. The very name of Mongol strikes fear in hearts that have heard only stories of conquest and destruction. But Marco carries more than merchandise on this journey. He carries the authority of empire itself, the accumulated wisdom of a court that has learned to rule through inclusion rather than mere domination. His mission is to extend that wisdom beyond the empire's current borders, to create connections that will benefit all parties, rather than simply extracting tribute from the defeated. The crossing of the Oxus River marks a transition not just of geography, but of reality itself. Beyond this boundary lie kingdoms that have never acknowledged the Khan's authority, peoples who worship different gods, follow different customs, organize their societies according to principles that challenge many of the assumptions on which the Mongol Empire has been built. The first city they encounter beyond the river is Merv, that ancient crossroads where the trade routes from China meet the pathways from India and the highways from Persia. The local ruler receives Marco's embassy with the careful courtesy due to powerful strangers, but his manner speaks of someone who is measuring threats as much as opportunities. "We have heard of the great Khan's power," the king tells him during audiences that stretch for days, each session a careful dance of diplomacy that seeks to balance curiosity with caution. But distance diminishes even the greatest authority. What can the Khan offer us here, beyond the reach of his armies, that we cannot achieve through our own efforts? It is a question that goes to the heart of empire itself, requiring Marco to articulate the Khan's vision in terms that make sense to people who have maintained their independence for centuries. The conversations range across topics that span trade agreements and cultural exchange, military cooperation and technological transfer, the delicate balance between sovereignty and mutual benefit. The Khan does not seek to rule you, Marco explains, drawing on years of experience in such negotiations. He seeks to include you in a larger enterprise, one where your knowledge and skills contribute to a network that spans continents. Your city sits at the crossroads of the world's trade. Imagine the possibilities. If those roads were guaranteed safe passage, if merchants could travel from China to the Mediterranean, knowing they carried the protection of a single authority. The negotiations continue for weeks, involving not just formal discussions, but elaborate ceremonies that allow both sides to demonstrate their capabilities without threatening gestures. Marco finds himself serving as cultural interpreter, helping each side understand not just the words, but the underlying meanings, the values and assumptions that shape how people see reality itself. The final agreements reached create something entirely new, not conquest or submission, but partnership based on mutual benefit. Local autonomy is preserved, but trade relationships are established that give merchants from both sides access to markets they could never reach independently. Knowledge flows both ways, with Eastern techniques solving Western problems, while Western innovations find application in Eastern contexts. This is the future of empire, Marco writes in his journal, understanding that he is witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in human history. Not the simple expansion of a single culture, but the creation of networks that allow different peoples to maintain their distinctiveness while participating in larger enterprises that benefit everyone. The return journey takes him through territories that now seem different, marked by the new relationships his mission has established. Caravanserais that once served only local trade now buzz with activity as merchants explore the possibilities opened by agreements that guarantee safe passage across political boundaries. Ideas flow along these routes as freely as goods, creating cross-pollination of knowledge that accelerates innovation in ways that no single culture could achieve alone. Back in Khanbalik, the Khan receives Marco's reports with the satisfaction of someone whose vision has been vindicated. You have proven once again that the Empire's greatest strength lies not in its ability to conquer, but in its capacity to include, he tells Marco, his voice carrying warmth that goes beyond mere approval. You have created connections that will outlast armies, relationships that will survive the rise and fall of dynasties. That night, Marco stands on the familiar palace balcony, looking out over the lights of the capital. But now he sees the city as just one node in a network that spans the known world, one voice in a symphony that includes the songs of 100 different peoples. The Silk Road stretches away in all directions, carrying not just goods but dreams, not just wealth, but the accumulated wisdom of humanity itself. The greatest adventure in human history continues, but Marco Polo has become something more than an adventurer. He has become an architect of connections, a builder of bridges between worlds that were once separated by distance and misunderstanding. The boy who left Venice in search of wonders has become a man who helps create them, who shapes the destiny of peoples and cultures across continents. Tomorrow will bring new missions, new territories to explore, new peoples to understand. But tonight, he rests in the knowledge that he has helped weave the world together, thread by thread, connection by connection, creating something larger and more wonderful than any single kingdom could ever achieve alone. The water of the Grand Canal laps against marble steps worn smooth by centuries of tides, its surface reflecting the morning light with the same gentle persistence that marked Marco's childhood memories. But the young man who stands at the bow of the galley that carries him home is no longer the 17-year-old boy who left Venice 24 years ago in search of adventure. He has become something unprecedented, a living bridge between worlds, a man whose eyes have seen the impossible made real. The city emerges from the morning mist like a memory recovering its substance, her palaces and towers rising from the water with the timeless grace that has made Venice the queen of the Mediterranean. But Marco sees it now with eyes that have witnessed Khan Balik's vast geometries, that have gazed upon Chengdu's ethereal beauty, that have watched the sun set over deserts whose horizons stretch beyond the edge of maps. Beside him stand his father and uncle, aged by their second journey to the Khan's court, but enriched beyond the dreams of avarice by the trading opportunities they have developed during their years in the East. Their ship rides low in the water, heavy with cargo that represents not just wealth but wonder, silks that seem to capture starlight, spices that carry the essence of distant gardens, gems that hold the concentrated fire of alien suns. The years in Cathay have changed them all, but Marco most of all. The merchant's son who left Venice has returned as something approaching a prince, carrying titles granted by the Khan himself, bearing authority that extends across continents. He speaks languages that no European has ever heard, knows customs that challenge every assumption about human possibility, carries in his memory the detailed knowledge of territories that exist only as blank spaces on Western maps. "Home," Niccolo says quietly, his voice carrying emotions too complex for simple words to contain. After all these years, all those roads, all those wonders. Home. But Marco feels the word differently now, understanding that home has become a more complex concept than the familiar palaces and narrow canals of his birth. Part of him will always remain in the gardens of Chengdu, in the throne hall where he knelt before the great Khan, on the roads that wind through landscapes where the very air tastes of adventure. He has become a citizen of the world in ways that make any single city seem confining. The galley makes its way slowly through the familiar waters, past landmarks that trigger cascades of memory. There is the palace where he learned his first lessons in commerce, the church where he prayed for safe journey before departing, the square where he listened to merchants tell stories of distant lands. But everything seems smaller now, bounded by horizons that he has learned to see beyond. Their arrival creates a sensation that ripples through Venice like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Word spreads through the city's network of gossip and commerce. The Polo family has returned, bringing with them tales of wonders that challenge belief, carrying cargo that represents wealth beyond calculation. Crowds gather at the docks, drawn by curiosity and the human hunger for stories that expand the boundaries of the possible. Marco's own family greets him with the mixture of joy and bewilderment that marks reunions after transformations so complete they approach the miraculous. His mother, aged by years of waiting but still graceful, embraces a son who has become a stranger, someone whose experiences have carried him so far beyond the familiar that communication requires translation even in their native tongue. "Tell us," she says simply, her eyes searching his face for traces of the boy she remembers. "Tell us everything." Oh, but where to begin? How to compress 2 decades of experiences that span continents into words that can be understood by those who have never ventured beyond the comfortable boundaries of European civilization. Marco finds himself struggling to communicate wonders that require new vocabularies, adventures that challenge the very concepts of possibility and impossibility. He speaks of cities that float on lakes, their bridges made from single blocks of jade, their palaces so vast that messengers use horses to carry communications from one wing to another. He describes ceremonies in the Khan's court, where a single gesture can alter the destiny of millions, where decisions are made that affect territories stretching from the edges of Europe to the shores of the Pacific. The stories he tells seem to hover at the boundary between history and legend, between fact and fantasy. He speaks of deserts that sing in the wind, of mountains so high they scrape the belly of heaven, of peoples who have developed sciences that make European learning seem crude by comparison. Paper money that holds value through imperial decree, printing that reproduces books with the precision of scribes, compasses that always point toward magnetic north, regardless of weather or location. Such things cannot be, his listeners murmur, their faces showing the confusion of minds struggling to process information that contradicts everything they have been taught about the world's limitations. No city could be so large, no court so rich, no empire so vast. But Marco has brought proof that speaks more convincingly than words. The cargo holds of their ship contain wonders that make his stories seem conservative by comparison. Silks that change color as light moves across their surface, porcelain so fine it seems translucent, mechanical devices that perform calculations with precision that humbles human arithmetic, maps that show coastlines and river systems of territories that European cartographers have left blank, marked only with warnings about dragons and the edges of the world. Venice receives these marvels with the sophisticated appreciation of a city that has made its fortune from international trade. But even Venetian merchants find themselves amazed by goods that represent levels of craftsmanship and technological sophistication they had never imagined possible. The cargo represents not just wealth but revelation, proof that human achievement has reached heights in distant lands that dwarf European accomplishments. But it is Marco's knowledge that proves most valuable. His detailed understanding of trade routes that could revolutionize commerce, his familiarity with peoples and customs that could open markets no European has ever imagined, his grasp of technologies that could transform every aspect of civilization, from navigation to manufacturing. "You have become rich in more than gold," the Doge tells him during audiences where the city's leaders seek to understand the implications of what the Polos have learned. "You have acquired knowledge that could reshape our understanding of the world itself." Yet Marco finds himself struggling with a melancholy that surprises him. Venice, for all its beauty and familiarity, seems somehow diminished after the vast territories he has crossed, the courts he has served, the peoples he has encountered. The narrow canals that once seemed like pathways to adventure now feel confining. The familiar faces somehow provincial after the cosmopolitan diversity of the Khan's empire. He has become something unprecedented, a European who truly understands the East, a Westerner who has been accepted into the highest circles of Eastern power. But that unique position also makes him something of an exile, someone who no longer fits comfortably into the world of his birth, yet can never truly belong to the world he has learned to love. The stories he tells begin to circulate beyond Venice, carried by merchants and travelers to courts across Europe. But distance and retelling transform them, turning careful observations into fantastic tales, reducing complex political and cultural analysis to simple adventures featuring marvels and monsters. The truth of his experiences becomes lost in the mythology that grows around his name. "They think I lie," Marco tells his father one evening as they sit in their palace overlooking the Grand Canal. "They hear my stories and believe I am creating fantasies to enhance my reputation." "Truth has its own power," Niccolo replies, his voice carrying the patience of someone who has learned to take the long view. "Your knowledge will find its way into the world, regardless of whether people believe the stories. The maps you can draw, the trade routes you can chart, the technologies you can describe, these will speak more convincingly than any tale of wonders." But Marco understands that something has been lost in translation, that the true meaning of his experiences, the vision of human possibility that service to the Khan revealed, the understanding of how different peoples can work together to create something greater than any of them could achieve alone, has been reduced to simple exoticism, to tales of strange customs and fabulous wealth. Years pass, and Venice settles into the rhythms of a trade empire enriched by new routes and new relationships that Marco's knowledge has made possible. The Polo family prospers, their understanding of Eastern markets giving them advantages that translate into wealth that makes them powers in their own right. But Marco himself remains somehow apart, a man whose experiences have carried him beyond the boundaries that define normal human existence. He begins to write, setting down in careful detail the true account of his journeys, his observations of peoples and places that exist beyond the horizon of European knowledge. The work grows slowly, each page an attempt to bridge the gap between the familiar and the impossible, between the world of his birth and the world of his choosing. The manuscript that emerges is something unprecedented, a geography of wonder, a careful catalogue of marvels that reveals the true size and diversity of the world. It tells not just of his own adventures, but of the larger human story, of civilizations that have achieved greatness through different paths, of the possibilities that emerge when peoples choose cooperation over conflict. Il milione, the Venetians call it, the million, referring not just to the wealth described in its pages, but to the multiplication of wonder that comes from truly understanding the world's diversity. But Marco knows that the real treasure lies not in the gold and silk he has described, but in the vision of human possibility that his journey revealed. The boy who left Venice in search of adventure has returned as a man who has helped shape the destiny of empires. The greatest adventure in human history has ended, but its echoes will resonate through the centuries, carrying the promise that the impossible is always just beyond the horizon, waiting for those brave enough to seek it. In the quiet of his study, overlooking the waters where his journey began, Marco Polo writes the final words of his account. Outside, the tide turns, and somewhere in the distance, a ship's bell tolls the hour. The Grand Canal flows toward the sea, carrying with it the dreams of a city that has learned to make its fortune from the far shores of possibility. The story ends where it began, but the dreamer has been transformed by the journey. And in that transformation lies the promise that adventures like his will continue as long as there are those willing to follow golden threads toward horizons that shimmer with the impossible made real.